Yes, I anticipate the state's third witness is going to be Investigator Bloomy. She's going to testify regarding the recovery of a 911 call. She prepared, I anticipate she'll testify that she prepared a transcript of that recording to the best of her ability. It may not be completely accurate. I have written out that transcript. I've provided a copy to Attorneys Hart and Powell. I have a number of copies is sufficient for the jurors. So before I'm playing it, I would ask that the bailiff give a copy to each juror. But the instruction informs the jury that you're going to get a transcript, but what is important is what you hear, and if there's a difference between what you hear and what you read, it's what you hear that's important. And I think they should know that before we play that. So.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Hart. Agreed. Okay, all right, and I have a copy of instruction 158. I'll be reading that when we get to that point in the state's case. For members of the public, thank you for being here. I know the deputy already spoke with you. Just remember to keep those cell phones off. The court did order sequestration of all witnesses yesterday, so if there's anyone present who will be testifying, this is the time to leave, since we'll be moving into testimony this morning. I did also have one request, members of the media. I hate to be admonishing you again, but I did have a request that you keep the talk down during testimony. Some members of the public weren't able to hear well yesterday. They said there was a lot of noise in the gallery, so please, keep it down. And with that, I think we're ready to bring in the jury. Gentlemen, you ready to go?
Yes.
All right, all rise, please. You can buzz in. Buzz in.
All right, Mr. Jury.
Good morning, everyone. Before you sit down, there are notebooks for you on your seats. It looks like most of you found those. So, but everyone, please take your seats. So, good morning, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. Thanks for being prompt. We are ready to proceed now. As I indicated yesterday, we'll be starting with the state's case, and there are note-taking materials for you, notebooks and pencils. If anyone, if your pencil breaks at some time, just let us know, and we'll get you a new one right away. Otherwise, we're ready to start, and we're going to start with the state and Mr. Tiffin.
Raise your right hand, please. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony given in this matter will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God, or under the pain or penalty of perjury?
I do.
Thank you. You can have a seat here. Speak clearly into the microphone. State your name and spell it for the record.
My name is Christopher Peters, CHRISTOPHERPETERS.
All right, thank you, Mr. Peters. We'll start with Mr. Tiffin.
Mr. Peters, you understand why you're here this morning, correct?
Correct.
In your own words, how come?
I'm here for the case between Michael and Joel and the events that transpired that night.
Okay. Person Michael, you know him, correct?
Correct.
In fact, you've known him for how long?
Most of my life, since I was born.
You met him when?
He was my neighbor back in the day.
And the Michael you're referring to, do you see him in court this morning?
Yes, I do.
Just point out where he is and what he's wearing as he's in court.
He's wearing a blue jacket with a blue tie.
To your far right at the table,
Correct.
I would ask the record reflect the identification of Mr. Mattioli by the witness.
No objection.
So ordered.
Mr. Peters, if you had to put a label on your relationship with Mr. Mattioli, what would it be?
A really good friend.
You also mentioned Joel, correct?
Correct.
What do you know about Joel? How long have you known him?
I've only met him once before that night.
And that night's the night why we're here, correct?
Correct.
You had met him once before that night, approximately when?
If I were to guess, it would be maybe a week or two before that.
And how did you meet him? What was the context of that meeting?
We were at a pub crawl.
And when you say we, who's the we?
Me, Michael, and Joel.
Just a little bit. You spent most of your life in Milwaukee, correct?
Correct.
You graduated from UWM.
Correct.
You have a degree in mechanical engineering.
Correct.
You currently employed?
Yes.
Doing what?
I'm a GM for a health and wellness store, and I do HVAC work on the side.
The reason you're here, the morning in question, where did those events happen?
At Michael's house.
And do you remember the address?
I do not.
It was in Milwaukee, wasn't it?
Correct.
About what time did you go to Michael's house?
Around 9 o'clock.
In the evening.
Yes.
And what was planned?
Just to hang out, have a couple of drinks. There's a bonfire there.
And how did you get there?
I drove.
You arrive. Who's there?
When I got there, it was Michael, Joel, and Andrew
And what's Andrew's last name?
Janowski.
And who is Andrew Janowski to you?
I met him in high school. He's a high school friend.
Still a friend of yours?
I haven't spoken or seen him since, but yes.
Since these events you're going to talk about, is that correct?
Correct.
But up to that point in time, he was your friend?
Yes.
You arrived, you drove there, correct?
Correct.
So once you're there, Mr. Mattioli, correct?
Correct.
Joel,
Correct.
Andrew Janowski,
Yes.
anybody else?
No.
And when you arrive, where are those three men?
From what I remember, they were in the backyard by the fire.
Basically, a bonfire going on in a fire pit, is that correct?
Correct.
What do you recall doing then once you arrived?
Just having a couple of drinks and just talking.
Outside?
Yes.
You had brought what with you in terms to drink?
I brought a 12-pack of Corona Seltzer and a little bit of vodka I left over.
At that time, and you remember what year this was?
2020.
Do you remember the date?
The investigator told me I spoke with April 19th, I believe. Or
That
April
seemed about
20th.
right?
Yes.
At that time, 3.5 years ago, you also were using cocaine, weren't you?
Yes.
Did you have cocaine with you?
Yes.
While you were there at Mr. Mattioli's house, you were drinking alcohol?
Yes.
Were you using cocaine?
Yes.
When you used it, did you use it publicly or did you hide what you were using?
I would hide.
And explain how you would do that.
I usually would go in the bathroom and use a key to do cocaine.
By yourself?
Yes.
And why were you hiding it?
Because I was at a police officer's house, and I didn't want anybody to know.
Did you use cocaine that evening with anybody else?
No.
While you're sitting outside, you're drinking, correct?
Correct.
Occasionally, if you can say how many times you would leave, excuse yourself, use a little cocaine and come back?
Maybe once or twice.
You didn't tell anybody what you were doing, correct?
Correct.
While you were outside, was there any communication between you and Joel about cocaine usage?
Verbally, no.
Through text message?
Yes.
Explain that.
So while I was there, Joel texted me, do you want to go in for some blow?
And blow means what?
Cocaine.
You received that from a text message?
Yes.
Did you respond either a text going back or verbally?
No.
Fair to say you just ignored it?
Yes.
While you're outside, do you ever see Joel excuse himself from the group and go somewhere else?
Not that I remember.
The four of you are basically sitting around drinking. How would you describe the setting? People getting along? What's going on?
Yeah, it was a really good time from what I remember.
How were you feeling? What were you talking about, if you remember? I realize this is 3.5 years ago. What do you remember?
I don't remember.
Okay. Do you remember what anybody was talking about?
Not specifically, no.
But what you remember is it's a good time, people are getting along. Is that fair?
Fair.
At some point in time, you leave the backyard, is that correct?
Correct.
About what time?
Maybe around midnight or so.
And do you remember why?
I think it was getting cold and the fire was worn out.
Where do you go once you leave the backyard?
We all went into the kitchen.
Of,
Michael's house.
and when you say we, who's the we?
Joel, Andrew, Michael, and myself.
There are four of you in the kitchen. Michael live alone?
Yes.
Anybody else in the house?
No.
There's a kitchen table in there, correct?
Correct.
Do the four of you sit around the table?
Yes.
What happens then?
I think we just did some shots, had a couple of drinks. That's all I remember, really.
To the best you remember, you're doing the shots and having a couple of drinks?
Yes.
How about Mr. Janowski?
I don't remember.
How about Mr. Acevedo? Joel?
I don't remember.
How about Mr. Mattioli?
I don't remember that either.
How would you describe your condition?
Intoxicated.
In the kitchen, while the four of you are sitting around the table, what are you guys doing?
Just drinking, maybe playing some cards. I don't remember.
Talking?
Yes.
How would you describe the atmosphere in the kitchen?
It was still joyful. Everybody was getting along.
Were you planning on going home, or what were you planning on doing that evening?
I was planning on sleeping over
And why is that?
because I don't want to drive when I'm under the influence of alcohol.
At some point in time, in fact, you went to a place to go to sleep, is that correct?
Correct.
Do you remember about what time that was?
Maybe around 1:30 or 2.
And where did you go?
I went to the basement.
What's in the basement?
A couch, and there's a bathroom down there. And that's about all I remember.
When you went to the basement, if you recall, where's Mr. Janowski?
I don't remember.
How about Joel Acevedo?
I don't remember.
How about Mr. Mattioli?
I don't remember.
You're in the basement. Did you fall asleep?
Yes.
What's the next thing you remember?
The next thing I remember, I woke up to some yelling,
Do you know about what time that was?
maybe around 7:30, 8.
In the morning, correct?
Correct.
The sound of yelling, where's it coming from?
It's coming from the living room.
And the yelling wakes you up, is that correct?
Correct.
Can you distinguish who's yelling?
At the time, no, but when I entered the living room, it was Joel and Michael.
So let me just back up a moment. You hear the yelling,
Yes.
correct?
Correct.
You're downstairs, it wakes you up.
Correct.
What do you then do?
I ran upstairs to see what was going on.
In those stairs from the basement, when you come up to the stairs, what room of Mr. Mattioli's house do you enter?
You enter the kitchen from the stairs.
You're in the kitchen. Do you see Joel Acevedo, Michael Mattioli, or Andrew Janowski?
Not in the kitchen, but in the living room.
The kitchen and the living room are really just separated by a small hall with a bathroom. Is that correct?
Correct.
So you see the three men in the living room. Is that correct?
Correct.
And what do you see or what do you hear going on once you're at the top of this, on the first floor?
I see Joel and Michael screaming at each other, and Michael was telling them to get out of his house and telling them to leave. And Joel was refusing to leave. And Michael mentioned something about Joel going through his pockets.
The living room of Mr. Mattioli's house, there's a front door right there. Is that correct?
Correct.
There's also a side door through the kitchen, correct?
Correct.
You're standing in an area that if somebody wanted to go out the side door, they'd have to walk through you. Is that correct?
Correct.
When you hear what you just described, Mr. Mattioli telling Joel to leave, where are they standing? Where, like, from the front door at Mr. Mattioli's house, where is he?
They were both right by the front door.
And where was Andrew?
I don't remember.
So again, what do you hear Mr. Mattioli saying to Joel?
I'm sorry.
What do you hear Mr. Mattioli saying to Joel once you're on the main floor?
He was telling him to get out, to leave his house.
And you heard him say why, correct? Or he was saying he did something, is that correct?
Correct.
What did you hear Mr. Mattioli say Joel did?
He's saying he was going through his pockets.
And what, if anything, do you hear Joel saying?
When Michael was asking him to leave his house, Joel was refusing, saying like, no, like, fuck you, stuff like that.
What do you remember happening then?
I remember Joel shoving Michael back.
Okay, just because there's a record, you demonstrated with your right arm going out with your palm open, correct?
I don't remember. I guess I was just using emotion, but I don't remember specifically. But I remember he shoved him.
Joel shoved Michael.
Correct.
That's in the living room?
Yes.
Causing Michael, Mr. Mattioli, to do what?
He like fell back a little bit.
Did he fall like on his back or his butt, or did he just sort of take a step back?
Took a step back.
What do you remember happening then?
Then I remember getting in between them and doing this motion, try to like separate them.
So you're between Mr. Mattioli and Joel.
Correct.
And what you've demonstrated is holding your hands out, arms out, trying to keep them separated. Is that correct?
Correct.
Is that what you demonstrated in court? Is that what you were doing?
From what I remember, yes.
What do you remember happening then?
After that, I got punched in the face.
Who hit you?
Joel.
Where in the face?
He punched me once in the nose, and then he also punched me right by my eye.
What happened to you as a result of being punched?
I fell backwards into the kitchen. I got knocked off my feet.
You were like on your butt, or were you on your feet?
I was on my butt. I was on my back.
What do you remember happening then?
I remember Andrew giving Joel a bear hug from behind, trying to stop him from coming at me.
When that happens, you're where?
I was in the kitchen.
And when you see Andrew give Joel a bear hug, where are they?
They are right, like where the living room and the kitchen meet. So
In the bear hug, is it chest to chest or is it chest to back? How?
I don't remember.
You see a bear hug between Andrew bear hugs Joel, correct?
Correct.
What do you remember then?
I remember Joel and Michael and Andrew. Michael and Andrew were trying to like detain Joel, like make him relax, and they all like fall over into the kitchen.
Are you still on your butt or have you gotten up at that point?
I was up at that point, and I was right by the side door.
The side door is a door that's in the kitchen that leads out to the driveway, correct?
Correct.
Correct to say that at that point in time, the four of you were all in the kitchen.
Correct.
What do you remember happening then?
I remember Michael saying he was going to call the police. He said that maybe 2 or 3 times. And then he went into his pocket to grab his phone, call the police.
And when Michael did that, where were you?
I was in the kitchen.
Where?
The same spot by the side door.
Where is Andrew Janowski?
Andrew was by Joel's feet.
Where's Michael?
Michael is by Joel as well, by his like chest, his upper torso.
And where's Joel?
Joel's on the ground.
Correct to say that 3 people are on the ground, you're standing up.
Correct.
And when you say Joel's on the ground, how is he on the ground?
I don't remember.
You don't remember if he's on his chest, his side, his back?
I don't remember.
And what do you see Michael doing?
Michael's reaching for his cell phone, call the police.
What is Joel doing?
Joel was swinging and like struggling, like fighting.
What's Andrew doing?
Andrew was on his legs.
What do you remember happening then?
Michael called the police.
And you're where when that happens?
The same spot by the side door in the kitchen.
What then happens when the call is made?
So Michael was talking to the cops, and I remember Joel swinging the phone out of Michael's hand.
You remember where the phone went?
Yeah, got knocked to the ground.
What happened then?
Then I picked it up.
And what did you do?
I talked to the dispatcher.
You're inside the kitchen?
Correct.
Are you paying attention to what Joel, Michael, and Andrew are doing at that time?
At that time, no.
What are you paying attention to?
Me on the phone call with the police.
What do you remember happening then?
I remember just speaking to the dispatcher, and they asked me for the address.
And what did you do?
Gave them the address.
And then what do you remember happening?
After the phone call, I went outside to wait for the police and smoke a cigarette.
You got out of the house walking through which door?
The side door
And where did you go?
in the driveway.
When you left the house, do you know the position Michael Mattioli, Joel Acevedo, and or Andrew Janowski were in?
I remember Joel was on his stomach, and Andrew was still by Joel's feet, and Michael was like putting his arm behind his back, like how like a police officer would detain someone.
And how is Michael, is he standing or how is he positioned in relation to Joel?
I don't remember.
go outside to smoke a cigarette, correct?
Correct.
To the best you recall, how much time passes? The police ultimately arrive, correct?
Correct.
And you meet them where?
In the driveway.
About how much time passed, best you recall, are you waiting outside for the police?
I'm not sure. If I had to guess, maybe 3 minutes, 4 minutes, 5 minutes.
The police arrive and what happens?
Police arrive and I tell them there's a police officer inside who needs help. And they walk to me, and I remember opening the door, and Michael's dog, he was barking loud, and I grabbed him.
Did you ever go back in the house or did you remain outside?
I remained outside.
Janowski, I'm just going to ask you, I'm not going to ask you to describe it, but this is an item, do you recognize what's the picture of?
It's a picture of me.
We're going to put it on the monitor.
Oh,
I'm just
okay.
asking if you recognize it.
Yes, I do.
Oh, what number is that?
13.
Thank you.
Mr. Janowski, can you see them up?
My name is Mr. Peters, sir.
Mr. Janowski, I put on the monitor,
My name is Mr. Peters, sir.
I'm sorry, I apologize.
No worries.
Put on the monitor Exhibit 13, correct?
Correct.
That is a picture of you.
Yes.
The house behind you, that is whom? Whose house?
That's Michael's house.
When you had talked about the living room, the front door, that's where I'm pointing at. Is that correct?
Correct.
In the side door, I'm pointing out right there. Is that correct?
Correct.
This picture, is this the picture as you were standing outside waiting for the police? To the best you remember.
To the best of my knowledge, yes.
Mr. Peters, in this picture, beneath your left eye, it's like a cross cut.
Correct.
Is that correct?
Yes.
And at your left lip, there's also a mark.
Correct.
What are those and how did you get those?
Those are from Joel punching me.
Judge, I would move into evidence Exhibit 13.
No objection.
Exhibit 13 is received and marked.
Judge, I have no further questions of Mr. Peters.
Mr. Hart?
Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Peters, you were asked to start your testimony if you knew why you were here. You're not here voluntarily, are you?
Can you clarify the question, please?
Sure, you were given a subpoena court order to appear this morning,
Correct.
and that's why you're here.
Yes.
To tell this jury what you recall about the events of April 19th and before.
Yes.
Okay, this gathering was a friendly gathering, am I right?
Correct.
A gathering of 4 friends to relax, unwind, have a couple drinks in Mr. Mattioli's backyard before the bonfire.
Correct.
And for most of the night, that's what happened, am I right?
Correct.
Now, you have known Mr. Mattioli since the two of you were children. You had only recently met Mr. Acevedo, is that right?
Correct.
And you told Mr. Tiffin that you believe you had met him a week or so before the 18th or 19th of April, but this pub crawl you speak of was a St. Patrick's Day pub crawl, am I right?
Correct.
And that happened where, downtown?
Yes.
And that was near the St. Patrick's holiday sometime in March?
Correct.
And that was a get-together of you, Mr. Janowski, Mr. Mattioli, and Mr. Acevedo.
Yes.
And it's at that pub crawl that you first met Joel Acevedo.
Correct.
And to the best of your recollection, you had never seen him or socialized with him before then?
Correct.
You were introduced at the pub crawl to Mr. Acevedo by Mr. Mattioli.
Correct.
And almost immediately upon meeting Mr. Acevedo, the two of you struck up a kinship, if you're comfortable with that term.
Sure.
And at some point within the first couple hours that you first met and were introduced to Mr. Acevedo, the subject of cocaine use came up, did it not?
Judge State objects to incidents that happened a month prior to this alleged offense.
Sustained.
Can we approach him?
Sure. Sidebar. Mr. Hart, could you restate your question, please?
I can. Mr. Peters, when you and Mr. Acevedo first met at the pub crawl, did the two of you have conversation about cocaine that night?
Yes.
And in fact, did you do cocaine with Mr. Acevedo that night?
I don't remember.
I'm sorry?
I don't remember.
Okay. For the vast majority of the time that you were outside, the evening of the 18th, were you and Mr. Acevedo separated from Mr. Mattioli and Mr. Janowski?
Yes.
And did you and Mr. Acevedo also share another head?
Can you clarify the question?
Sure, cigarettes.
Yes.
You smoke cigarettes, do you?
Yes.
And you knew that Mr. Acevedo smoked cigarettes?
Yes.
How about Mr. Janowski and Mr. Mattioli?
No, they don't.
All right, so would there be times during the evening when you were outside that you and Mr. Acevedo would excuse yourself and separate from the other two fellas while you would go enjoy a cigarette together?
Yes.
Okay. Where would that take place?
Away from Andrew and Michael.
And while you attempted to hide your cocaine use that night, there was no disguising what the two of you and Mr. Acevedo were doing when you were smoking cigarettes, am I right?
Correct.
While it may be against the law to snort cocaine, and that's something you would want to avoid in a Milwaukee police officer's home, smoking cigarettes was no big deal. Fair?
Fair.
All right. And when the night was over, that bottle of vodka that you brought, was that exhausted? Was it done?
I don't remember.
And how about the seltzers that you brought?
Yes, they were gone.
So the 12-pack of Corona seltzers, either you individually or you with the others had consumed all of those?
As far as I remember, yes.
Was there other alcohol at the party?
Yes.
And was it generally understood that those who came over would bring their own?
Yes.
Okay, and is that what happened that evening?
Yes.
Do you remember what Mr. Acevedo was drinking?
I don't remember.
And would that also be true of Mr. Mattioli and Mr. Janowski?
Correct.
Okay, so during the evening, maybe once, maybe twice, you would sneak out to do cocaine kind of surreptitiously. Mr. Tiffin asked you whether you saw Mr. Acevedo attempt to do the same, and I think your testimony was you did not. Is that right?
Correct.
Do you remember, Mr. Peters, speaking with members of the Milwaukee County District Attorney's Office and the Milwaukee Police Department following their arrival at the scene?
Yes.
In fact, you initially spoke with an officer at the scene briefly, and then later you were taken to the District Attorney's Office for a more in-depth recorded interview. Is that true?
Correct.
And specifically, do you remember speaking with Officer Grams later in the day?
Yes.
And do you remember telling Officer Grams that you saw Mr. Acevedo go to his car several times that evening?
Yes.
And do you remember what that said to you or signaled to you as you observed it in real time?
Unusual behavior.
And possible what?
Possible drug use.
By Mr. Acevedo.
Correct.
And the reason you thought that that was at least possible is because that's how guys who are doing drugs around people who don't do drugs slide away without tipping themselves off. Is that fair?
That is fair.
And in fact, that's what you were doing.
Correct.
And when you saw Mr. Acevedo behave similarly, that's what came to your mind.
Yes.
And that's what you told Detective Grams.
Yes.
Okay. Do you recall during portions of the evening receiving FaceTimes on the iPad from some of Mr. Mattioli's other friends?
Yes. Yes.
And did those calls, those FaceTimes occur both when you all were outside by the fire and then later inside around the kitchen table?
I don't remember outside, but I do remember being in the kitchen.
That would have been later at night.
Yes.
So sometime after midnight, when you fellas went from the outside to the inside, these calls came in?
Yes.
And do you remember more than one of them?
No, I don't.
Do you remember who it was that was FaceTiming with Mr. Mattioli?
Yes, Michael's friend Loki.
I'm sorry.
Michael's friend Loki?
Loki. And do you recall whether it was Michael's friend Loki who contacted Mr. Mattioli or Mr. Mattioli called him?
I don't remember.
Had you socialized with Loki before?
Yes.
And do you know if he was one of the people that at least was extended an invitation to come over to Mr. Mattioli's that evening?
I'm not sure who was invited.
Did you participate in the FaceTime with Loki?
I don't remember.
Did Mr. Acevedo, do you know?
I don't remember.
And during that FaceTime, everyone again was getting along famously.
Yes.
There was no strife
No.
and no suggestion that anyone was either unhappy, hostile, aggressive towards anyone.
Correct.
And when the time came that you had had enough for the evening, you decided to call it quits somewhere around 1:30 or 2, is that right?
Correct.
And when you made that decision, you told the guys you were going to bed and went downstairs, which is where you generally stay when you would stay over at Mr. Mattioli's, is that right?
Correct.
Did you have specific conversation with Mr. Mattioli that night about whether you would be staying, or was it just assumed?
It was just assumed.
And by that you mean you understood that you would be drinking to the point of intoxication. Mr. Mattioli knew likely that you would drink to the point of intoxication, and nobody was interested in anybody getting in a vehicle. Is that fair?
Correct.
And so when you went downstairs, your recollection is the other 3 fellas remained seated around the kitchen table?
Yes.
And when you got downstairs, you fell asleep on the couch? Is that what happened?
Correct.
And that's where you remained until you heard the yelling coming from upstairs somewhere around 7:30 the next morning?
Correct.
And when you heard the yelling, you heard voices but weren't able to identify them because you're down a level in the basement. Do I have that right?
Correct.
And with respect to the basement level, the stairs comes out of the kitchen, is that true?
True.
And at the top of the stairway, there is no door, is that true?
Correct.
Okay, so it's not as though there's a basement door that was closed when you went down there. As the ruckus is going on upstairs, you can hear it straight down the stairway.
Yes.
And your reaction is to come upstairs, is that right?
Correct.
To see what's going on.
Yes.
And was there any indication when you went to bed, Mr. Peters, that anybody should be arguing or quarreling about anything?
Not at all.
And I think it goes without saying, but to that point, the previous night, no one had put their hands on anybody else or had a cross word.
That's correct.
To that point, when you went to bed, do you know where Mr. Janowski and Mr. Acevedo were planning on staying that night?
No.
When you stayed at Mr. Mattioli's overnight before, had you ever stayed over when Mr. Janowski was there
Yes.
and stayed over?
Correct.
And to the best of your recollection or understanding, was that Mr. Acevedo's first appearance at Mr. Mattioli's home, if you know?
Can you repeat the question?
Sure. Do you know whether that was the first time Mr. Acevedo had been to Mr. Mattioli's?
I'm not sure.
But you know you had never been there with him before.
Correct.
And when you and Janowski had been there before, do you know where Janowski stayed then?
I would assume upstairs on the couch. I upstairs, I mean the first level.
I only want to know what you know.
Okay, I do not know.
I mean,
No.
did you ever see Mr. Janowski sleeping on the couch upstairs
Not that I remember.
before this night?
Correct.
Okay. And when you came upstairs, to the best of your recollection, where was Mr. Janowski?
On the couch.
Was he sleeping still?
I don't remember.
Was he actively engaged in the yelling between Mr. Acevedo and Mr. Mattioli?
He would. Can you clarify the question?
Sure. Was Mr. Janowski engaged in the yelling between Mr. Acevedo and Mr. Mattioli?
I don't remember hearing them yell.
Mr. Janowski.
Correct.
Okay. And when you got to the top of the stairs, what you observed is Mr. Mattioli yelling, "Hey man, you need to get out of my house. You need to leave." You heard him say that.
Yes.
Did you say that once, or did you say it more than once?
More than once.
Yelling to Mr. Acevedo, you need to go.
Correct.
And did you know what he was talking about, why he wanted him to go?
I don't remember at that time, but I remember Michael saying, "You're like stealing from me. You're going through my pockets."
You heard him say that.
Michael, yes.
Mr. Mattioli said that to Mr. Acevedo.
Yes.
And you need to go now.
Yes.
And how did Mr. Acevedo respond?
He said no, like, fuck you, some along those lines. He refused.
Mr. Acevedo responded directly to Mr. Mattioli, fuck you, I'm not leaving.
Yes.
I'm not leaving your house even though you're commanding me to leave. Is that what you heard?
Yes.
Now, this conversation or yelling took place in the living room near the front door at the bottom of the stairs which lead upstairs, is that right?
Can you repeat that, please?
Sure. The yelling that you're telling us about right now, leave, fuck you, I'm not leaving, that occurred in the living room, in the room where you later learned Mr. Janowski had been sleeping?
Yes.
And that's at the bottom of the stairway that leads up to Mr. Mattioli's bedroom, is that true?
That's true.
And also near the front door.
Correct.
And in all the times that you had stayed or been to Mr. Mattioli's home, had you ever used that front door?
I would assume so. I
I want you to assume again.
Yes.
You had.
Yes.
Okay. On this particular night, did you come in the kitchen door, if you remember, or the front door?
The side door.
That's the door that leads into the kitchen.
Yes.
Okay. I want to show you what. You know how many.
If you start with like, you're fine.
I'll show you what the mark for identification purposes as Exhibit 25. And ask you if you can identify this exhibit.
It's Michael's living room.
That's Mr. Mattioli's living room?
Correct.
All right. You see the coat hanging there?
Yes.
And where is that on the railing?
Yes.
And where does that railing lead?
Upstairs.
Upstairs, and what, have you ever been upstairs?
Yes.
What's upstairs?
A bedroom.
Is that Mr. Mattioli's bedroom?
Yes.
All right. And there are stairs coming down past the coat. In the bottom right-hand corner of Exhibit 25, what do you see there?
There's a printer in the way. I can't see.
Oh, what? I'm sorry.
There's a printer in the way. I can't see right now. Can I stand up?
Sure. Actually, you can look right there. Oh. You see the bottom right-hand corner?
Yes.
What is that?
That's a couch.
That's the couch where Mr. Janowski was sleeping?
Yes.
And do you see the doorway there past the couch?
Yes.
Where does that lead?
That leads to the kitchen.
And how about to the left of that doorway?
That's around where the basement entrance is.
All right, so is that where you came out of?
Yes.
And the kitchen then would be to the back right, and the more immediate right leads you into the living room.
Can you repeat that?
Sure, coming out of the basement, up the stairs, you go straight, you go into the kitchen, and if you make kind of a sharp right, you're in the living room.
Correct.
And that's where the three men were when you heard the yell.
Yes.
Okay. And then the front door is to the left of the stairway, is that right?
Yes.
Okay. That's the 25 days.
No objection.
Exhibit 25 is received and marked.
Mr. Peters, after this initial round of yelling between Mr. Acevedo and Mr. Mattioli, you tell us that Mr. Acevedo reaches out and grabs or pushes Mr. Mattioli, is that right?
Correct.
And was that the first time anyone had put their hands on anyone else at the party?
From what I remember, yes.
In other words, other than leave my house, you need to leave, fuck you, there was nothing that precipitated Mr. Acevedo reaching out and putting his hands on Mr. Mattioli.
Correct.
He's the first person to make physical contact with another.
Yes.
And how would you characterize Mr. Acevedo's demeanor?
Enraged.
Enraged?
Correct.
Aggressive?
Yes.
When that occurred, where were Mr. Mattioli's hands?
I don't remember.
Do you remember telling law enforcement that at that point in time, Mr. Mattioli's hands were down by his sides?
Yes.
So as you think about it, is that where Mr. Mattioli's hands were?
Yes.
When Mr. Acevedo reached out and either punched or pushed or grabbed him?
Correct.
And Mr. Mattioli's response to being grabbed or punched or pushed was to take a step back, is that what you said?
Yes.
But it did not knock him over.
No.
At that point in time, you are still at the threshold of the stairway leading down to the basement?
Yes.
Somewhere between the kitchen, the living room, and the basement stairs.
Yes.
Would you call it the landing? Is that a fair description?
Yes.
How do you respond to seeing Mr. Acevedo put his hands on Mr. Mattioli?
I tell him to relax, and I go in between them and kind of push Joel.
You told Mr. Acevedo to relax?
Yes.
Meaning, hey, we don't need to do this, guys.
Correct.
We're all friends.
Yes.
I don't know what set you guys off, but
Exactly.
stop.
Yes.
Is that what you were doing?
Yes.
And again, tell us about the relative size of Mr. Acevedo and Mr. Mattioli.
He's much bigger than Michael. He's taller and stockier.
Mr. Acevedo
Relative to Michael, yes.
was a big man,
Yes.
stocky and put together.
Correct.
Were you able to separate the two of these guys? Let me back up, strike that question. They didn't need to be separated, or did they? I mean, they weren't engaged in a fight at that point, am I right?
Correct.
So you really weren't separating them, you were saying, hey,
Yes.
relax, Joel.
Yes.
Did he?
No.
What did he do?
He punched me in the face.
How hard did he punch you in the face?
Very hard.
Did it make a smack?
Yes.
You ever been punched in the face?
Yes.
In fact, you have some boxing training, do you not?
Correct.
You know what it means to have your bell rung?
Yes.
Did the punch from Mr. Acevedo ring your bell?
Absolutely.
And what does that mean to you?
That means when your bell gets rung, that means you're kind of out of it, and you're like stunned.
Stunned.
Yes.
And Mr. Acevedo then followed that up with a second punch.
Correct.
To your cheek, is that right?
Yeah, cheek, eye, yes.
And the marks that are apparent on your face in Exhibit 13 below your left eye, and I think there's a scratch on your left cheek, those were caused by Mr. Acevedo punching you twice after you told him to relax.
Correct.
What in the world would cause Mr. Acevedo at that point to throw two punches at you?
Objection calls for speculation.
If you know.
Sustained.
I mean, you hadn't done anything untoward to Mr. Acevedo at that point, had you?
No, I haven't.
And when you say Mr. Acevedo appeared enraged and aggressive, Is that the way you remember Mr. Acevedo when you went to bed the previous night?
No.
Was it 180 degrees difference than the way you went to remember Mr. Acevedo before you went to bed that night?
Yes.
And in your world, had anything occurred that would cause Mr. Acevedo to turn so dramatically in just a couple hours?
No.
So as you sit here today, you have no real explanation for that.
No.
I'm correct?
Correct.
Okay. After Mr. Acevedo hits you twice, you say that Mr. Janowski bear hugs Mr. Acevedo from behind. Is that what happened?
I remember him bear hugging him, yes.
Around the waist?
Around the torso area.
Okay. And that led into the kitchen. Is that what I heard you say?
Yes.
And Mr. Mr. Mattioli was with Mr. Janowski. Is that right?
Yes.
And was Mr. Mattioli saying anything to Mr. Acevedo?
I remember saying he was going to call the police.
And did Mr. Acevedo respond to that?
I don't remember.
Okay. Was there a struggle going on at this point?
Yes.
Who was struggling with whom?
Michael, Andrew, and Joel.
And you say, I think, that Mr. Janowski was behind Mr. Acevedo. Is that right?
Yes.
Was Mr. Mattioli also behind Mr. Acevedo?
I don't remember.
Did there come a time when Mr. Acevedo wound up on the kitchen floor?
Yes.
Do you know how he got there?
I think he got wrestled down.
And by wrestling, you're not talking about punching, are you?
No.
At any point, Mr. Peters, while you were in the presence of Mr. Acevedo, Mr. Janowski, and Mr. Acevedo, did you ever see Mr. Mattioli take a swing or take a punch at Mr. Acevedo?
No.
Never.
Never.
Would that also be true of Mr. Janowski?
Yes.
And at some point, Mr. Janowski was able to get himself on Mr. Acevedo's legs. Is that right?
Correct.
Do you know why he did that?
Objection calls for speculation.
Sustained.
When you saw Mr. Janowski on the legs of Mr. Acevedo, where was Mr. Mattioli?
By his torso.
By his torso. And were they, Mr. Acevedo and Mr. Mattioli, actively engaged in a struggle?
Yes.
And was the purpose of that struggle, based upon your observations, to attempt to get Mr. Acevedo on the ground?
To get him under control.
Under control?
Yes.
How do you know that?
Because Joel was like flailing and yelling and screaming, and he was angry. He was upset.
Mr. Acevedo?
Yes.
And was Mr. Mattioli equally upset?
Can you clarify?
Sure. Mr. Acevedo had just punched one of Mr. Mattioli's guests in the face twice. How did Mr. Mattioli respond to that?
Oh, yes, he was upset with the situation. Yes.
And he had verbalized that he believed to that point Mr. Acevedo was stealing from him. Is that right?
Yes.
And now he had punched his guest twice in the face,
Correct.
stunning one of them. And so were the two of them equally engaged in a struggle in an effort to get Mr. Acevedo on the ground until police could arrive?
Yes.
And how do you know that?
How do I know?
How do you know that that's what was going on? Was that what Mr. Mattioli was actually saying?
Yes.
Get on the ground, Joel. Get on the ground.
I don't remember saying get on the ground.
But he was trying, by your observation, to get Mr. Acevedo down.
Yes.
And was Mr. Acevedo staying down?
No.
Was he standing up and down and up and down? Did you see that?
Yes.
Roughly how many times did that occur?
4 or 5?
And while that was occurring, was Mr. Acevedo swinging his arms as you previously described?
Yes.
Do you remember the time that Mr. Mattioli was able to get his cell phone free?
I remember him getting his cell phone, yes.
And was he able to punch 911 on the phone?
Yes.
Did you hear the 911 dispatcher pick it up?
Did I hear them pick it up?
Yeah, did he or she respond?
Yes.
Hello, 911.
Yes.
You heard that?
Yes.
And within how many, or how quickly did Mr. Acevedo knock the phone out of Mr. Mattioli's hands?
Roughly 10 seconds?
Almost instantly.
Yes.
Several seconds, 10 seconds.
Yes.
And do you believe that was a deliberate effort on Mr. Acevedo's part based upon what you saw?
Yes.
Or did it just happen in the struggle?
I would say it just happened. I don't remember specifically if, you know.
And did you pick up the phone then?
Yes.
And did you then pick up the conversation with 911?
Yes.
Did you remember telling the 911 operator, this man is attacking us? Is that what you said?
Yes.
Who are you talking about?
I was talking about Joel.
Mr. Acevedo.
Yes.
And when you said us, who did you mean?
Me, Michael, and Andrew.
And do you remember telling the 911 operator, please come as soon as possible?
Yes.
Is that what you were trying to do, get the police there?
Yes.
Were you trying to hurt anyone?
Did I try to hurt anyone? No.
Were you trying to hurt anyone?
No.
What you and Mr. Mattioli were doing was trying to summon the police to get them there to apprehend Mr. Acevedo, who had just assaulted you, as quickly as possible. Am I right?
Yes.
Did that happen?
Did what happened?
Did the police arrive?
Yes.
And before they arrived, did you leave the kitchen?
Yes.
And when you left the kitchen, was Mr. Janowski stationed on Mr. Acevedo's legs, and Mr. Mattioli was on Mr. Acevedo's torso?
Andrew was by his legs, and Michael was trying to, you know, like put his arm behind Joel's arm behind his own back.
To restrain him?
Yes.
Well, why in the world would you leave the kitchen?
Because I just got rocked in the face, and I just woke up probably a couple minutes before that, and I was scared and hurt.
Were you a little shaky and your
Absolutely.
eggs scrambled?
Absolutely.
Is that why you walked outside to get some fresh air?
Yes.
Smoke a cigarette?
Yes.
Wait for the police?
Correct.
Did you do that?
Yes.
When the police arrived, did you show them inside?
Yes.
Did you explain to them that this was an off-duty officer's house, Michael Mattioli?
Yes.
And did the officer ask you if there was any kind of dog inside?
I don't remember if he asked me.
Did you tell him that?
Did I tell him what?
You tell him there was a dog inside.
Oh, yes.
Now, during the struggle between Mr. Mattioli and Mr. Acevedo, were things remaining calm in the home?
Can you repeat the question?
Sure. Were things remaining calm, or were things flying all over the place?
It was loud. It sounded like there was a struggle inside.
Yeah, I mean, these were two big men who were wrestling from the living room into the kitchen. Did the lamp get knocked over? Did that happen?
I don't remember that.
You don't remember that.
I don't remember that.
Did the dog food bowl get kicked aside? You remember that?
I don't remember that.
Did things fall off the refrigerator onto the ground?
I'm not sure.
All right, I want to just briefly go back to Exhibit 25. How big an area are we talking about?
It's a very small area.
Small area.
Yes.
I mean, you can literally stand with your foot in the kitchen, in the living room, and in the threshold to the basement, can't you?
Yes.
I mean, that's how tight it is.
Correct.
And you got these two big people, Mr. Acevedo and Mr. Mattioli. You're standing there, and Mr. Janowski is standing there, all trying to make sense of this.
Yes.
Okay. I need to go back just to one subject. at some point in the evening before you go to sleep, do you get a text from Mr. Acevedo?
Yes.
Now, you, Mr. Acevedo, can speak freely. I mean, you're right there. Yes?
Yes.
But instead, you get a text from Mr. Acevedo. That's true?
Correct.
And you remember what the text subject was?
He asked me if he wanted to throw down for some blow.
And what did that mean to you?
I mean, if I want to spend money with him to buy cocaine.
Throwdown means contribute to a party.
Yes.
And as I understand your testimony, you never responded.
Correct.
I want to show you what's been marked as Exhibit 26 for identification purposes. And ask you first if you can identify this guy.
Yes.
And what does that represent?
It's a text message from Joel to me.
Okay, the green is are the text messages from Mr. Acevedo to you?
Yes.
Are you able to see the time that text was sent?
I cannot.
All right. Look right on that screen, right in the bottom right.
May I stand up again?
Yes.
It says 11:02 p.m.
Yeah, I think it says 9:11 and 2 seconds. You see that?
Yes, I do.
And that says on April 18, 2020, that's the night you all gathered at Mr. Mattioli's.
Correct.
It says 414-840-6359. Whose cell phone is that?
That was my old cell phone number.
Okay. This is Joel trying to go in on some blow. Is that what he texted you?
Yes.
And then, can you see the second text at 1:40 the next morning, 1:40 and 4 seconds?
Yes.
And again, that is, based on your recollection, a text from Mr. Acevedo to you at the same cell phone asking, can we go to the basement? Do you see that?
I see that. I don't remember that text specifically.
You don't remember receiving that text?
Correct.
Do you know why Mr. Acevedo would be interested in going in the basement with you?
Objection calls for speculation.
Sustained.
The basement would have been a place away from Mr. Mattioli and Mr. Janowski, am I right?
Yes.
Oh. Thank you. I would ask that Exhibit 26 be received.
I don't object.
Exhibit 26 is received and marked.
Thank you, Mr. Peters, that's all.
Thank you, Mr. Tiffin.
I have no redirect.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Peters. You can sit down. And the state's next witness, Mr. Tiffin. Come in.
State calls Andrew Janowski.
Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you give in this matter will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God, or under the pain or penalty of perjury?
I do.
Thank you. You can have a seat there. Speak clearly into the microphone. State your name and spell it for the record.
Andrew Janowski, first name A-N-D-R-E-W, last name J-A-N-O-W-S-K-I.
Thank you, sir. We'll start with Mr. Tiffin.
Mr. Janowski, how old are you?
33.
And how are you currently employed?
I work as a case manager,
For whom?
Wisconsin Community Services.
Previously, you were employed by the Department of Corrections as a probation and parole agent, correct?
Yes,
And previous to that, you were a correctional officer in an institution, is that correct?
yes.
Who is Christopher Peters to you?
He's a friend.
And you've known him since high school?
Yes, freshman year of high school.
And who is Michael Mattioli to you?
He was a friend that I met through Chris Peters.
And Michael Mattioli, do you see him in court this morning?
Yes,
Please identify where he's seated as he's in court this morning.
he's on my right-hand side, wearing blue shirt and blue tie.
I would ask the record to collect the identification of Mr. Mattioli by the witness.
No objection.
So ordered. Mr. Janowski, could you pull the mic a little closer to you, please?
Yes, Judge.
Do you remember approximately when you met Mr. Mattioli?
I would say it was the summer of 2019.
And after meeting him, what label would you put on your relationship?
He's a great guy, he's a great friend.
Friends, correct?
Correct.
You had been to his house?
Correct.
Mr. Janowski, I'm just going to show you some pictures. I'm not going to ask you to describe them because I'm on the monitor. I'm just going to ask you if you recognize what these are pictures of. Yes or no? Don't describe it. Do you recognize what it's a picture of?
Yes.
Yes or no?
I don't recognize that.
Yes or no?
Yes.
Yes or no?
Yes.
This one you don't, correct?
Yes.
Exhibit 4, which is a picture, can you see the monitors? If you need to stand up, you can.
Yes, I can see it.
What is Exhibit 4 a picture of?
The front entrance to Michael Mattioli's home.
This is the front entrance, correct?
Yes.
There's a stairway. If one is looking at the front entrance on the right, there's a stairway, correct?
Correct.
And it goes where?
Upstairs.
And this area, as one's looking at the picture to the left, is what room?
To the left is the living room.
This is Exhibit 6. We're putting it in this. Recognize what that is a picture of.
Are you asking what it is a picture of?
Yeah, you recognize what part of, what is a picture of?
I'm unsure which stairwell that is, but it's the stairwell on a lamp.
Let me just show you Exhibit 4. You recognize this. There's this red coat, correct?
Correct.
Exhibit 6. Does that look like the same coat?
Yes.
So this stairway, based upon what you testified, would be stairs leading where?
It's the upstairs.
And then Exhibit 10. That is a picture of what?
That's the living room area central hallway.
What I'm pointing at is a sofa in the living room,
Yes,
and then what I'm pointing at right here, that's the bathroom.
yes, it appears to be.
And if one went through this door, that's the kitchen.
I would believe so.
And then there are stairs leading to the basement, is that correct?
I'm unsure which side that would be on, but
Okay. You've already explained how you know Christopher Peters, Mr. Mattioli. You know we're here regarding something that happened to Joel Acevedo, correct?
correct.
Who was he to you? How did you know him, if you knew him?
I met Joel one other time previous to this evening.
And when approximately was that, and what was the setting?
March 2020, I met him prior to the Shamrock Shuffle.
Shamrock Shuffle is what?
It's a bar crawl.
And how did you meet Joel at the Shamrock Shuffle?
I met him prior to going to the event through Michael.
Michael Mattioli introduced you to Joel, is that correct?
That's correct.
I'm going to focus in on why we're here. Events happened in Mr. Mattioli's house, correct?
Correct.
They happened in the morning, is that correct?
Yes.
You had spent the night in Mr. Mattioli's house?
Yes.
I'm going to start before you slept there, okay?
Okay.
Fair to say there was an agreement or invitation to come over to Mr. Mattioli's house, is that right?
Yes.
And who invited people over?
If I recall correctly, it was Michael that invited me over.
About what time did you go over?
It was after 8 p.m.
And how'd you get there?
Drove my personal vehicle.
You arrive by yourself or with anybody else?
By myself.
When you arrive, is there anybody else there?
I recall seeing Joel Acevedo's car parked outside on the street. Walked in the backyard. It was Michael and Joel. Those were the only two individuals there,
So when you arrive, there are now 3 people there, is that correct?
including myself, yes.
When you first arrive, what are Mr. Mattioli and Joel Acevedo doing?
They were sitting in the backyard.
And is there a fire?
Yes, there was.
They're sitting by the fire.
Yes.
You had brought over what to drink?
I brought over some beer.
Once you get there, do you join those two sitting by the fire?
I did. We exchanged pleasantries and spending time in the backyard with them.
I'm sorry,
Can you repeat that, please?
Oh, sorry.
Do you join them?
Yes.
At some time, does another person come over?
Yes.
Who is that?
Chris Peters.
Prior to Chris getting there, is it accurate to say you, Joel, and Michael Mattioli are sitting by the fire, just drinking?
That's accurate, yes.
How would you describe the mood? Are people getting along? How would you describe it?
It was a good mood. It was a good mood.
Chris comes over, Mr. Peters, is that correct?
That's correct.
And what happens when he comes over?
It was, we welcomed him, from what I recall. I don't recall anything changing,
Are there then 4 people sitting around a fire?
including Chris, yes.
Anybody else there?
Not that I can recall.
The 4 of you are outside, you're sitting by the fire. For how long?
I would say a few hours.
And during that period of a few hours, What's going on?
We were just talking out there, having some drinks. Recall smoking a cigar out there too. There was nothing that really stood out.
Who was smoking the cigar?
Myself.
Anybody else?
Michael may have been smoking one as well.
Were you aware of anybody using any type of illegal drug?
Not that I knew of.
At some point in time, you leave the backyard, is that correct?
That's correct.
About what time and why?
I'm unsure what the time was. This was 3.5 years ago now, but I remember the fire had started going out and it was getting late.
Once you leave the backyard, where do you go?
Inside the house.
And who goes in the house?
I recall myself going in, obviously. I know Michael went inside as well. I can't recall if Chris and Joel went in either.
Where do you remember going?
I remember going into the kitchen area.
And what did you do in the kitchen?
Sat around, talked, had some more drinks inside of there.
Who was sitting around you talking?
I recall for the majority of the time it was myself and Michael.
Do you recall, did Joel and or Chris ever join you and Michael in the kitchen?
Towards the end of my time being awake and being in there, yes, I do recall them coming.
And then, what do you recall them doing?
They were just sitting at the table drinking with us, talking.
Anybody playing any games or just talking and drinking?
We were just talking and drinking.
How would you describe the mood amongst the four of you?
It was a good mood. We were telling jokes. We were just having a good time.
You at some point in time had moved your car, is that correct?
That's correct.
When did you do that?
It was prior to going inside the house. It was, I would say, before midnight.
Your car was originally parked on the street?
That's correct.
Where'd you move it to?
Michael Mattioli's driveway.
And why?
I was going to stay the night over there.
Because you'd been drinking?
Yes.
At some point in time, you end up going somewhere to go to sleep, is that right?
That's correct.
Do you recall approximately what time that was?
I don't recall. It was likely after 1 a.m.
Where do you go?
I go to the living room on a big couch.
And that couch that you sort of saw the corner of in one of the pictures, is that the couch where you went?
I believe so.
You went there to go to sleep?
Yes.
When you went to go to sleep on the couch, do you know where Michael Mattioli was?
I recall he was in the kitchen still.
Do you know where Christopher Peters was?
I believe he was in the kitchen as well.
Do you recall where Joel Acevedo was?
I believe he was in the kitchen as well.
Had anybody else come over to that house?
No.
Did you end up going to sleep?
I did.
What's the next thing you remember?
I recall the next morning I heard I was laying on the couch and it's like when you're awakened by something or your senses are perked up and I could hear two individuals talking and it was progressively getting more agitated or upset tone.
So you're on that couch in the living room and you hear what you just described. Voices getting more upset. Those are your words?
Yes.
Where are those sounds coming from?
It was from behind me. I knew it was somewhere behind me.
On the floor where you are?
I was sleeping on the couch.
On the first floor, correct?
Yes, correct.
Those voices, were they in the basement, on the first floor, or on the second, the upper floor?
It sounded as if it was on the first floor behind me.
Did you immediately, Once you become conscious, not sleeping, do you recognize what the voices were? Whose voices, excuse me?
Yes, I could recognize it.
And whose voices?
It's Michael Mattioli and Joel Acevedo.
What do you recall being said?
I can't recall the exact verbiage, as this was 3.5 years ago, but it was something along the lines of Michael stating that Joel had gone through his pants pockets or that he had stolen from him and for him to leave the house.
And in response to those words, what do you recall, to the best of your ability, Joel saying?
I recall him saying something along the lines of he did not steal anything. And there's some other profanities.
Those words are or are not simply conversational.
I would say, given the context of how it was stated, it didn't sound to be conversational.
Fair to say that there are voices, would it be fair to say they're yelling at each other, or how would you describe it?
They weren't yelling at each other, but it was an elevating tone.
What do you do? You've woken up, you've heard what you just described. What do you do?
I stood up from the couch. I didn't involve myself directly with the situation. I stood right there and was watching them,
And you're watching whom?
both Joel and Michael.
At that point, do you see Christopher Peters in that room?
Not at that time.
What do you remember happening then?
Pardon?
What do you remember happening then? You've gotten up from the sofa, as you described, correct? Or the couch.
Correct.
Michael Mattioli and Joel Acevedo are confronting each other.
Correct.
What do you remember happening then?
I recall something happened that made Michael stagger back.
Do you know what that thing was?
I don't know.
Okay.
But it was something where I saw him visibly stagger back. And Michael's tone elevated at that time, yelling, ordering Joel to get out of the house.
Michael was yelling at Joel to get out of the house.
Yes.
In response to that, is Joel saying, yelling anything in response?
He was at a heightened state of agitation. I don't recall what exactly he was saying when he was upset.
What do you remember happening then?
I recall Chris Peters coming from somewhere and also in a very heightened, animated type of way, yelling at Joel to get the fuck out of the house was what he was saying.
Chris was yelling at Joel?
Yes.
You don't know where Christopher Peters came from, though, do you?
I don't know.
What are you doing?
I'm still standing here in the living room.
Have you inserted yourself into what's going on?
I have not.
What do you remember happening then?
I recall when Chris came upstairs and started yelling at Joel that Joel struck Chris, and Chris went, essentially, my recollection, flying down the hallway.
Is that the hallway that leads to the bathroom or the kitchen?
The hallway that would be facing westward.
Chris knocked off his feet? If you remember.
I don't recall him being, I don't recall. He fell down.
Chris did.
Yes.
Did you see what caused him to do that?
He was struck by Joel.
What do you remember happening then?
Recall Michael involved himself physically and decentralized Joel into the kitchen area.
And when you say decentralized, describe what you mean by that word.
It's like a tackle.
Where are you at that point?
I was still in the living room, and once he had tackled him, I came around the corner and saw him on the kitchen floor.
So you come into the kitchen, is that correct?
That's correct.
Where do you see Joel?
Just on the ground.
On the ground, how?
He was on his stomach, and Michael was straddling his back.
And by straddling, describe what you saw.
mounted position.
So it'd be fair to say that Joel is between Michael's legs? Yes or no?
Yes,
Where's Michael's chest?
to the best of my recollection, it was still elevated at the time.
What happened then?
I involved myself. I placed my body over the back of Joel's legs. I could see that he was struggling with Michael.
Why?
I did that because I knew that the police were on their way.
How do you know that?
I had just heard, call the police, call 911, something along those lines.
And where's Mr. Peters?
I don't recall where he was at that time.
Once you put yourself on Mr. Acevedo's legs, what do you see happen with respect? Mr. Acevedo's on his stomach, correct?
Correct.
What do you see happen with respect to Michael? How he's positioned on Joel?
I could just see his back. That's all I could see.
You've been interviewed, it's been 3.5 years, correct?
That's correct. It has been 3.5 years.
Fair to say your memory is not as good today, is that correct?
My best recollection is that would be in the reports given, my statements made that afternoon.
Do you remember being interviewed in June of 2020 by Investigator Dallin, Investigator Bloomey, and you were with your attorneys?
I do recall.
Do you recall telling them during that interview that you knew that Michael, I quote, I knew that he had Michael's weight on his upper body. You know, maybe from that, he was lying face down on the ground. Do you remember that?
I don't recall the particular statements I made, but that is an accurate recollection.
So Michael's weight is on Joel, is that correct? His chest.
I don't recall if it was his chest. I would just see him straddling him.
But you recall, as you said, he had Michael's weight on his upper body, correct?
Yes.
Were you aware that a 911 call had been made?
I was.
When did you become aware of that?
I could hear Chris talking with the dispatcher.
And when you heard that, where were you?
I was laying across the back of Joel's legs.
What do you hear, to the best you remember, what do you hear Joel do?
I don't recall hearing anything from him 3.5 years later, but I recall him struggling on the ground.
And by struggling, just describe the best what you saw.
Actively resisting, trying to get up.
Was he able to get up?
No.
Why?
I'm presuming because of Mr. Mattioli and myself.
Where's Mr. Peters?
He was in the kitchen area at some point. I don't recall where he went after that.
Did you ever hear any doors open or close or anything?
I don't recall.
What do you remember happening then?
I recall continuing to stabilize Joel on the ground, knowing that law enforcement was on their way, and I knew that they would take over the situation once they were there. That's what was going through my head.
Are you saying anything to Michael?
I can't recall saying anything to him other than I made a statement out loud saying, "What is going on here?" Something to that effect.
Do you recall Michael saying anything to you?
I don't recall him saying anything to me.
Do you recall Joel saying anything?
I don't recall him saying anything.
What's the next sort of event that you recall happening?
I recall the police coming in through the kitchen door.
And when the police came in, where's Joel?
Still on the ground.
On his side, back, front?
He's on his stomach.
Where are you?
across the back of his nose.
And where are you looking? Where's your head? Are you looking in the direction of where Michael and Joel are? Are you looking forward? Or are you looking away from them?
I don't recall where I was looking at that time.
Police come in, correct?
Correct.
What do you recall happening then?
I recall they took over the situation. They told us something to the effect of, just get off him. My understanding, interpretation of that was that they were going to take over the situation.
And then what do you recall?
I recall getting off him. I recall Michael getting off him. I recall them rolling Joel over. And at that time, that's when they started CPR on him.
And then what do you remember happening?
I recall being taken out of the home very quickly, shortly after that.
By a police officer who had arrived, is that correct?
Yes.
Judge, I have no further questions of Mr. Janowski.
Thank you. It's been about an hour and a half. I think this would be a good moment for a break. It's about 11:15. We'll start with Mr. Hart's cross-examination after the break. Ladies and gentlemen, please leave your notebooks on your chairs. You should only be taking notes while evidence is being presented. And remember, you still can't talk about the case. So you've heard some testimony now, but we still have to hold all those thoughts and discussions for deliberations, please. Take about a 15-minute break. All rise, please. Take your seats. Mr. Janowski, you can sit down. You're on break as well, but 15 minutes. Did just want to get the sidebar on the record. We had a brief sidebar regarding the, this was during Mr. Peters' testimony. I met with the attorneys in chambers. I think at that point the parties agreed to Mr. Hart's restating the question in a slightly different way. Attorneys, did you want to address that any further, Mr. Hart?
The state objected. We had a brief conversation. The state's objection was the relevance, I think, of conduct that occurred several weeks before this. I indicated in chambers that I was attempting to connect this up to the knowledge of Mr. Acevedo that Mr. Peters was interested in doing cocaine. I indicated that I would just ask one or two questions and move on. I think the court was satisfied with that. The state's objection was noted. I asked the two questions and then I moved on.
Thank you, Mr. Tiffin.
It's all fair. It's a fair recitation.
I agree. Okay, thanks. All right, gentlemen, and ladies and gentlemen in the gallery, we're on break until about 11:02.
Thanks.
there's nothing that people want to get behind something. And that's why they don't like it. That's why all this like LGBTQ plus stuff gets all this. It's because people can rally behind something because there's no great war. There's no like red enemy. You know what I mean? Like during the Cold War, there's nothing that we can unite us to get together to beat the tribalism to fight something. So yeah, we find stuff. And it's the same thing on a family level. Whereas they have a lot going on. They're doing, and it's a simplistic view of it. You know, but this is their essential fiber. You know what I mean? Like they can say, look, it's a. Yeah. So that's what we want. I get it. I think that I would like to.
Regardless of the outcome.
Yeah, I think well because. Yes, that's. Yeah, it's big bucks that you right away.
He's like, oh, you're trying to sue me, you know what you're dead.
Right, yeah.
Because guess what?
That's what I got. Right. What is it called? Like, do you know, paychecks garnished $50 for the rest of my life? Okay. I mean, yeah, you enjoy the $5,000 you're gonna get over the course of my life. Like, yeah.
It's also a reason
Right, yeah.
No, I like
Yeah.
It's through the American Cyber Association.
Yeah, really? Oh, yeah, see, there you go.
And they have attorneys back with it.
Oh, okay. Well,
They
yeah.
don't have defendant.
Oh,
Because
really?
there's very few attorneys that know. Like, that's a very specific type of case law.
Oh, yeah, that, yeah. It's bird law. Like, you ever watch Always Sunny or no?
Yeah.
Always Sunny, it's bird law. Like, when you get, like, yeah, it's very specific. Like, yeah, no, I'm
But, oh, yeah, so I'm not going to insurance for that.
yeah, that's just smart. Sad that you need it, but smart. You need it.
That's what Glenn was saying, but I'm like, it all comes down to insurance.
It's, yeah, that's obvious.
Because here's the thing, do you have a million question? Or do
Right.
you have a commercial job?
I know. Yeah, no, you're 100% right.
So that's, and I hear Tony say it's also part of the trial.
Yeah.
This piece was the last night. Honestly, it also would not surprise me.
Yeah, that's what Tommy said. Tommy said that he's a and I was like, yeah.
I speak with our media guys again for a moment? Come on in.
So this is your courtroom today?
Yeah. Yeah, we're normally not up here. Normally we're in G55. So. Yeah. Yeah. My partner, because my normal partner was here yesterday.
He's good.
Yeah, yeah, so he started making shit tonight. He's gone.
Oh, you know.
Yeah. Where do you guys want to do?
He could stand, yeah. I don't know if Judge wants. Yeah, I don't know if Judge wants me to stay at the stand again.
We think the problem was the mic right above the deputy. So, right up there.
Do you want this to be not seen on the stand here?
Yeah, that would be great. And then, but we'll get, that'll be clear.
Okay.
Okay, let's get back on the record. I just wanted to address briefly on the record a discussion I just had with the attorneys as well as our media reps. We did get a call saying that the streaming that's being done right now was picking up what they described as side conversations, but the caller was not specific as to what conversations were being picked up on the feed. We believe it is most likely the microphone positioned above the bailiff, our deputy. And so the media folks are going to disconnect that microphone. We're just going to rely on the court system. I don't think this will be a problem going forward. And attorneys, did you want to address that any further? Mr. Tiffin?
No.
Or Mr. Hart? Okay. All right, gentlemen, thanks. I'll ask Mr. Janowski to come back in. Or Mr. Janowski, if you want to come up and take the stand, we'll bring the jury back. What's that, sir?
Stay standing, Judge?
Yes. Yeah, until the jury comes in, and then we all take our seats.
I think they just. I'll pick one. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
thanks everyone. Please take your seats. Well, folks, we're back to Mr. Janowski's testimony, and we'll start with Mr. Hart.
Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Janowski, I want to show you what's been marked for identification purposes as Exhibit 27 and ask you if you can recognize the folks in that picture. You don't have to tell me who they are, just tell me if you recognize them.
Yes, I do.
All right, can you identify for us, please, the people in that photograph?
It's Michael Mattioli on the left-hand side. It's myself, Andrew Janowski in the center. On the right-hand side, that's Joel Acevedo.
And based upon your testimony, do I understand that that is the night that you met Mr. Acevedo?
That's correct.
And was Mr. Acevedo introduced to you that night by Mr. Mattioli
Yes,
as a friend of his?
yes,
And is that the pub crawl we've heard about?
yes, that's the Shamrock Shuffle.
Shamrock Shuffle, sometime around St. Patrick's Day 2020, is that right?
Yes,
A number of weeks, 5-6 weeks prior to the events that bring you to this courtroom this morning.
yes,
In addition to the three of you in that photograph, was Mr. Peters also a part of that crawl?
yes,
And as far as you know, is that also the day that Mr. Peters was introduced by Mr. Mattioli to Mr. Acevedo?
to the best of my knowledge, yes.
Okay, and until the events of April 18th, did you have any other interaction at all with Mr. Acevedo?
I had not.
Did not?
Prior to,
Yeah.
sorry,
After this night, until April 18th, did you have any contact at all with Mr. Acevedo?
I don't recall having any in-person contact with him, no.
Any other type other than in person?
I don't recall that either.
I would ask that 27 be received.
No objection.
Exhibit,
All right, so you
hold on.
received,
Exhibit 27 received and marked.
thanks. You received some indication from Mr. Mattioli that he was having a get-together at his home, and you went over there that night, yes?
Yes,
Took with you some beer and met up with Mr. Peters, Mr. Acevedo, and Mr. Mattioli sat out by the fire and smoked and joked, as it were.
yes,
And for the better part of the night, if not the entire night, nothing untoward was going on between you all. You were having a splendid evening.
yes, that's the truth.
And if I understand your testimony, was there at least some physical division between you and Mr. Mattioli smoking cigars and Mr. Peters and Mr. Acevedo, at least physical proximity?
Yes.
And for the entirety of the night, what percentage, if you can put a percentage on it, would you say there was that division?
I don't know the exact percentage that would be, but it would be, I would say, over 60% of the evening.
All right,
Maybe
you
more
were
than
all,
that.
I'm sorry.
Maybe more than that.
All right, you were all there together and enjoying one another's company, but there was a physical division between 2 and 2. Do I have that right?
That's correct.
And not because of any animosity, just interest. You were smoking cigars perhaps, and at times the other two were smoking cigarettes, among other things. Is that fair?
That's fair to say.
And there was never a time where either you or Mr. Mattioli or Mr. Peters and Mr. Acevedo said, hey, what's wrong with you guys? You're being antisocial, or words to that effect.
Not that I can recall.
Right? That wasn't the vibe. This was a nice night where guys are hanging out and enjoying one another.
That's what it felt like, yes.
Okay, and after you, the fire dies down or it gets cold, you move the party inside, is that right?
Yes.
And when you're inside, you recall others joining via video feed?
At one point in time, yes.
And tell us about that.
I remember, if I recall correctly, it was Michael's phone, and it was another officer, another Milwaukee police officer I had met previously through him. I knew him as Loki.
And did he call in? Is that what happened?
I don't recall if he called in or Michael had called him, but he was on video chat and we had a brief exchange.
With the fellas around the kitchen table,
It was just me and Michael at that time.
around the table.
It was in the kitchen area, if I recall correctly.
When this fella Loki calls in, Mr. Acevedo and Mr. Peters, by your recollection, are not part of that?
To my recollection, they were not inside the house.
Okay. Okay. And eventually the party ends, at least that evening, and you decide it's time to go to sleep. Is that right?
Yes.
Now, had you discussed with Mr. Mattioli before deciding to go to bed the arrangements that evening that you'd be staying over?
I recall where it was me pulling my car into the driveway. That was where I was going to stay over.
And that was when you were still outside?
That's correct.
And there was kind of an open invitation, is that right? If you had too much to drink and you didn't feel you were in a condition to drive home, that you could stay at Mr. Mattioli's?
That's correct.
And you had done that before?
That's correct.
And so you pulled your car into his driveway from the street so that you wouldn't get a ticket or whatever, you would get up in the morning and go about your business.
Yes.
And when you decided to go to sleep, you kind of fell out on the couch in the living room, is that right?
That's correct.
And had you stayed on that couch when you had slept over before?
Yes, I have.
And I'll show you what's been received into evidence as Exhibit 25 and ask you if that's the couch you are referring to.
On the right-hand side?
On the right-hand side, yes.
Yes.
That's the couch that you slept on in Mr. Mattioli's living room.
Yes.
And your testimony and your best recollection is you were the first one to knock off, is that right?
Yes.
And when you left the party, the other three guys were still at the kitchen table in the house.
To the best of my recollection, yes.
And was it your, or is it your recollection that at that point it was clear that everybody was going to stay because the party had gone on too long?
I had made that assumption, yes.
All right. And do you know where Mr. Acevedo slept that night?
I don't know.
Do you know where Mr. Mattioli slept that night?
I don't know.
And you know where Mr. Peters slept that night?
I don't know.
Okay. The next thing you know is there is a stern discussion in the living room the next morning.
Yes.
And were you, to be clear, intoxicated when you went to bed?
I would say yes, I was.
And how were you feeling when you were awakened in the morning?
I'd say tired and just wondering what was going on.
And what was going on?
Some kind of heated discussion.
The substance of which initially you had no idea.
Yes,
Am I right?
that's correct.
You came to learn that there was an accusation by Mr. Mattioli that Mr. Acevedo was either stealing or rummaging through his pants pocket. Is that right?
Yes,
And you heard Mr. Mattioli say that?
yes,
And in response, Mr. Acevedo denied it.
yes,
And Mattioli was insistent at that point that Mr. Acevedo leave his house.
yes,
I'm correct?
you're correct.
To that point, had anybody laid hands on anybody else?
Outside of the part where I recall Michael staggering back into the stairwell area, no one else.
But you didn't see what caused Mr. Mattioli to stagger back, yes?
That's correct.
And when you say stagger back, can you demonstrate on this screen where Mattioli was when he staggered back? You're pointing to the bottom left edge of the photograph, Exhibit 25?
That's correct, at the foot of the stairwell.
At the foot of the stairwell back toward the front door?
In that general area, yes.
All right, and you can see about the middle of the left edge of that photograph a light bulb. Can you see that?
Yes.
And in the other exhibit, you saw what appeared to be a lamp broken and on the ground. Do you remember that photograph?
I do.
Do you know how that lamp made its way onto the ground?
I can't recall.
Do you think it may have been as a result of his staggering back after whatever happened to him?
Objection calls for speculation. He said he can't recall.
Fair enough, withdrawn. Do you remember seeing it fall?
I don't recall.
All right. After Mr. Mattioli staggered back, what is the next thing that you recall happened?
Mr. Mattioli raised his tone, became more forceful in telling Joel to get out of the house, that he was going to call the police.
That's what you heard Mr. Mattioli tell Mr. Acevedo.
Yes.
Hey, man, you got to go. And if you don't, I'm going to call the police. You remember hearing him say that?
Yes.
More than once?
I don't recall how many times, but it was more than once.
And did Mr. Acevedo leave?
No.
What did he do instead?
It was Chris Peters that came from some room at that point in time and started using the same narrative, you saying, get the fuck out of the house. A very, agitated, animated way.
Peters did.
Yes.
Now, Peters came from the basement, you learned?
Yes.
And based upon what you saw, would Peters have had any idea what Mattioli was talking about?
I honestly don't know.
But he picked up Mr. Mattioli's narrative using your words saying, hey, you need to leave the house, dude.
Yes. Yes.
And that is what you believe prompted Mr. Acevedo to strike Mr. Peters.
I believe it was just based upon Mr. Peters' actions, just a heightened state of agitation.
Now, to be clear, Peters never took a swing at Acevedo, right?
That's correct.
And Mr. Mattioli never took a swing at Mr. Acevedo, am I right?
That's correct.
The only person swinging was Mr. Acevedo.
That's correct.
And he did it more than once, am I right?
I don't recall if it was more than once.
Well, something caused Mr. Mattioli to stagger back.
Yes.
And then we know that you observed him strike Mr. Peters right in the face.
Yes.
Tell us about that punch, please. Let me rephrase that. Tell us about the force of that punch.
I just recall Mr. Acevedo's back being towards me where I was standing in the living room. And I saw Chris Peters go flying down the hall, essentially, the west hallway in the house. He fell to the ground.
But to use Exhibit 25 again, are you talking about the hallway underneath the archway that leads to the kitchen, the bathroom, and the downstairs stairway?
It would be that hallway, yes.
And the force of Mr. Acevedo's punch to Mr. Peters' face caused Mr. Peters to what appeared to be fly back into the hallway. Is that right?
That's correct.
Would you call that unprovoked?
I would say it was. There's no physical provocation on Chris Peters' end.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
There's no physical provocation on Chris Peters' end.
All right. How about physical provocation by Mr. Mattioli?
There wasn't.
Were you able to see Mr. Mattioli's hands throughout the initial confrontation?
I don't recall.
Did you ever see Mr. Mattioli square off or raise his hands above his waist?
No.
After the punch to Mr. Peters, what happens with Mr. Acevedo?
That's when Michael tackled Joel, or decentralized him to the ground.
Now, you use the term decentralized. Where does that term come from?
Just during my employment at the Department of Corrections, that's how I knew taking someone to the ground. That's the decentralization technique.
All right. To back up a moment, you were an agent for the Department of Corrections as a probation parole agent?
That's correct.
And in that job, you received some basic training. Is that true or not true?
That's correct.
And from time to time, you would encounter people that you were supervising who would get agitated?
That's correct.
And a decentralized tactic is something that you were familiar with,
Yes.
and at least in some basic way trained in.
Yes.
In addition to being a probation and parole agent, were you also a corrections agent?
Correctional officer, yes.
Correctional officer?
Yes.
That is to say, you worked in an institution?
Yes.
And would you have to use those decentralization tactics when prisoners got combative from time to time?
Yes.
And when you saw Mr. Mattioli attempt to decentralize Mr. Acevedo, how did he respond, Acevedo?
I can't recall what exactly he did. It was,
Well, did he take it or did he struggle back?
he was struggling.
And was that a give and take for the next minute or two?
I would say he was actively struggling on the ground, yes.
Mr. Acevedo was actively struggling,
Yes.
as Mr. Mattioli was attempting to decentralize.
Stabilize him, yes.
I'm sorry.
Stabilize.
Stabilize him.
Yes.
And at some point, Mr. Acevedo, Mr. Mattioli was able to get Mr. Acevedo on the ground, yes?
Yes.
And you laid across Mr. Acevedo's legs. Do I have that right?
Laid across his legs, yes.
And to be clear, Mr. Mattioli never asked you or requested that you lay across his legs.
He did not.
Why did you do that?
Joel's size, seeing what had just unfolded in front of me, and just, I didn't want him to cause any further harm towards anyone there.
Didn't want who?
Joel to cause any further harm based off what I had all seen.
After he punched Mr. Peters in the face, you didn't want to see him cause any further harm.
Yes.
And so as Mr. Mattioli was attempting to stabilize him, you laid across his legs as you were trained to do?
Yes.
And did you remain on his legs until law enforcement arrived?
I did.
And if I understand your testimony, while the struggle ensued between Mr. Acevedo and Mr. Mattioli, you don't recall hearing them say anything back and forth?
I can't recall.
Now, you're not saying it was silent in that kitchen, are you?
I'm not.
You're saying 3.5 years later you don't recall exactly what was being said?
I don't.
Hey, let me go. Things like that wouldn't be inconsistent with what was going on in that room.
That's correct.
And you would agree with me, would you not, that you told law enforcement after they were trying to get your story that Mr. Acevedo was fighting like crazy? Those are your words, yes?
If I said that in the statement, that's correct.
If you said that in the statement, that's what was going on. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, that would be to the best of my recollection at that time.
Did you ever see Mr. Mattioli take a swing at Mr. Acevedo?
I did not.
Now, it's not easy to talk about these things. I can tell you've been affected by it. Am I right?
Yes.
And one of the reasons that this is difficult for you is because, as a human being, you understand how avoidable this whole event was, wasn't it?
Yes.
And do you ever think about what would have happened if Mr. Acevedo would have left as Mr. Mattioli had asked him to initially?
Objection, relevance.
Sustained.
You ever think about what had happened if Mr. Acevedo hadn't struck Mr. Peters right in the face?
Again, it's not relevant.
Sustained. And we're getting into speculation.
Did you ever observe Mr. Mattioli at any point to be the aggressor in the confrontation between the struggle between he and Mr. Acevedo?
He was not the aggressor.
Who was the aggressor?
Joel.
From the beginning?
Yes.
Thank you.
Mr. Tiffin?
Just one or two, maybe three. Mr. Janowski, I know you had contact with Mr. Acevedo when you had your legs on his legs, correct?
Correct.
Did you ever bear hug him?
I don't recall bear hugging him, no.
Okay. No other questions?
Thank you. Mr. Hart?
Yeah, I have just one. It's not exactly responsive to Mr. Tiffin's question, but from the time you left Mr. Mattioli's house that day in 2020, you haven't had any contact with Mr. Mattioli, have you?
I have not.
I'm sorry?
I have not.
Thank you.
Nothing.
Okay. All right, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Janowski. You can step down. 11:30. Mr. Tiffin, I think we could start with your next witness. Thanks.
They call Sarah Blooming.
Do you solemnly swear or affirm that you will, you solemnly swear that the testimony given in this matter will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God, or under the pain or penalty of perjury?
I do.
Thank you. You can have a seat there. Speak clearly into the microphone. State your name and spell it correctly.
Investigator Sarah, S-A-R-A-H, Bloom, B-L-O-M-M-E.
How are you currently employed?
I'm an investigator, a sworn law enforcement officer. I work for the Milwaukee County District Attorney's Office.
And how long have you held that position?
5 years.
Prior to becoming employed as an investigator in the Milwaukee District Attorney's Office, how are you employed?
I worked for the Milwaukee Police Department for about 28 years. I was last a detective and assigned to sensitive crimes.
As an investigator in the Milwaukee District Attorney's Office, describe your duties or responsibilities.
We assist the District Attorney's Office in handling investigations and cases presented for prosecution. In addition, we respond to critical incidents in the on-call capacity. On-call capacity.
Both in your current job and in your job with the Milwaukee Police Department, just describe, within Milwaukee County, there are a number of law enforcement agencies, correct?
Yes.
Each city has their own police agency.
Yes.
There's a sheriff's department.
Yes.
There's investigators from the Milwaukee District Attorney's Office, correct?
Correct.
How is the responsibility, who's responsible for investigating what, where? Excuse me.
If a case is presented to the District Attorney's Office,
Well, let me ask this. If an incident happens somewhere,
yes.
let's say Milwaukee or West Dallas,
Oh,
who has responsibility?
whoever jurisdiction it is and whoever gets dispatched. And then there is a procedure for whatever type of incident it is for agencies to respond.
On April 19th of 2020, investigators from the Milwaukee District Attorney's Office responded to 4502 West Cleveland Avenue, correct?
Yes.
That's in the city and county of Milwaukee?
Yes.
Why?
It was a critical incident, which means there was a serious event that involved a police officer off duty or on duty.
Who assumed responsibility for investigating this incident?
The Milwaukee County District Attorney's Office,
Why not the Milwaukee Police Department?
because one of the individuals involved was a Milwaukee police officer.
You are familiar in the course of your employment with 911 calls, is that correct?
Yes.
Are 911 calls recorded?
Yes.
Are those recordings saved?
Yes.
As part of the investigation of the incident that happened at 4502 West Cleveland, first let me ask you this. That's a residence, is that correct?
Correct.
Did you come to learn whose residence it was?
Yes.
Who's that?
Michael Mattioli.
And in the course of investigation, you were involved in this investigation, correct?
Yes.
And have you come to see and do you know who Mr. Mattioli is?
Yes,
Do you see him in court?
I do.
Please identify him.
He's seated at defense table. He's wearing a blue suit with a blue tie and a light blue shirt.
Would ask to reflect the identification of Mr. Mattioli by the witness.
No objection. So ordered.
As part of the investigation, you know that Milwaukee police officers responded to that location, is that correct?
Yes.
You know why they responded?
It was in their jurisdiction, and a call was sent to the City of Milwaukee Police Dispatch.
911?
Correct.
Was that recording obtained?
Yes.
Through your knowledge of this case, who was present at 4502 West Cleveland when the incident happened?
Prior to police arrival, my understanding is Joel Acevedo, Michael Mattioli, Andrew Janowski, and Christopher Peters.
As a result of your investigation, are you familiar with what each of those people sound like?
Yes.
You did obtain the 911 call?
Yes,
You listened to it.
I did.
Did you also do anything in addition to listening to it?
I transcribed it to the best of my ability, and it was placed on inventory as evidence.
What number is that? You have seen that before, correct?
Yes.
What is Exhibit 3?
This is a transcription of the 911 call that I generated.
That transcription, is it fair to say was done to the best of your ability?
Yes.
So the disc, it has a sticker number 1 on it, correct?
Yes.
It's labeled 911 call.
Yes.
Judge, at this time, in a moment, I'm going to play it. We do, though, have copies of Exhibit 3, so I'd ask your bailiff to distribute to the jurors so they can go along when I play it. If the judge wants, if you want to instruct them on what we talked about.
Thank you. And is there any objection from the defense?
No.
All right, thank you. So, yep, bailiff, please proceed. And so, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to wait until you receive these copies, and then I have a short instruction for you. So, members of the jury, you are about to hear an audio recording. Recordings are proper evidence, and you may consider them just as any other evidence. Listen carefully. Some parts may be hard to understand. You are also being provided with a transcript to help you listen to the recording. If you notice any difference between what you heard on the recording and what you read in the transcript, you must rely on what you heard, not on what you read.
For the record, I put Exhibit 1 into the CD player. There are then 4 files. I'm going to open up a file marked distribution. Detective or Investigator Bloom, I'm just going to ask you to come off and look at, if you can just come off and look at the screen. And if you need to look at the one closer to you, so I'm going to ask you, you recognize what nice informed incident distribution, this page? Does that indicate what time and what date the 911 call was received?
Yes, it was received on Sunday, April 19th at 7:28 a.m. Central Daylight Time.
And what time did the call end?
Ended at 7:32 a.m. Sunday, April 19th, 2020.
This page then contains the audio file, correct?
Yes,
To your knowledge, that's the audio file of the 911 call?
correct.
I'm going to go back and have a seat, please. I'm going to play this file.
Hello?
Detective Blooming, I've stopped at 15 seconds in the file. What you understood being said was what and by whom?
In the beginning, I can hear "Let Me Go Home," which was said by Joel Acevedo. My score is not woke. Overlaid with that is the 911 operator asking hello.
That word, score, in your job, have you run into that word before?
Yes,
In what situation?
usually in drug investigations.
And to you as an investigator, what does that word mean?
To me, it means the supplier for the drugs is not awake.
I'm going to continue playing that. I'm just going to play this through.
Yes, 911. Hey, I'm a police officer, and I need help over at my house.
What's the
4502 West Cleveland Avenue.
What is the address? Hello, what is the address?
Oh, yeah.
Hello? Hello? Hello, sir? Hello? Hello?
Hey. 4502 West Cleveland Avenue. 4502 West Cleveland Avenue.
What's going on there?
What was that?
What is going on at the location?
4502 West Cleveland.
What is going on there?
There's a man that's attacking us. The man, police officer's house. This man is attacking us.
Okay, what's this man's name?
The man attacking us, his name is Joel.
You said Joel. Is he white, black, Hispanic, Asian?
He's, Hispanic. And, yeah. Michael Mattioli is police officer. We're here.
I'm sorry, say that again?
Michael Mattioli, name of the police officer, the house we're at. The man is attacking all of us. Just fucking
Is anyone hurt?
Yeah, just please come as soon as possible.
Sir, I need you to just answer the questions. Is anyone hurt?
Well, yeah. I'm a fucking bleeding nose. Sorry, swear to you.
Do you need medical attention?
No, I don't. Fucking lay down. I ain't you, asshole. You fucking did.
How many people were attacked, sir?
You wanna fucking blame this on me? You don't blame us on everybody but you. At least two. But you fucking did this. Yeah, Michael, don't worry.
2 people, including you, or you and one other person, sir?
Me and at least one other person.
Okay.
We got a murder control.
Okay, and Joel is still there, correct?
Correct. Oh, yeah. Yes, he is.
And your name?
Yeah. I'm Chris.
Chris?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so it's 4502 West Cleveland Avenue. It's a single-family house?
Oh, yes, ma'am.
All right, we got help on the way, okay?
Thank you very much.
All right.
Did you want to collect those?
Yes, Deputy, if you could please, collect the transcripts. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to ask you to pass those back to the deputy. Mr. Tiffin?
Detective Blumey, what was just played in court, is that the 911 call that you obtained as part of this investigation?
Yes,
And in your transcript, you ascribed words to certain people, correct?
yes.
And what was your basis for doing so?
I have met, met Mr. Mattioli in person on scene. I know the sound of his voice. I also met in person Mr. Peters and Mr. Janowski and recognized their voices. And based on the investigation and the individuals at the house is how I identified the voices for each person.
Judge, I have no further questions. This witness, I would move into evidence. Exhibit 1, which is the recording, and for the record, Exhibit 3, which is the transcript.
Any objection?
No objection to either.
Exhibits 1 and 3 are received and marked. And over to Mr. Powell.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning, Investigator Blumey. Start by saying this transcript was done to the best of your ability, correct?
Yes,
And you would agree with me that that recording is not always of the best quality, correct?
correct,
It's not capturing everything that's being said in the room by each person, correct?
correct.
And so you've done your best in this transcript, right?
Yes,
And you would acknowledge, I believe, that it's very likely or possible that you got some things wrong in your transcription of what we heard.
I think it's best to, it's transcribed to the best that I was able to.
To the best you could.
Yeah,
Okay. Now, clearly there's the sounds of a physical struggle going on in the room as well, right?
yes,
Okay. Now, your involvement in this investigation was not limited to collecting the 911 call, right?
correct.
You did some other things in the case, talked to witnesses, looked at different body cameras, things like that, true?
Yes,
And do you recall, there were two officers who initially arrived on scene, Officers Roach and Shara Mehta, is that right?
correct.
And you viewed the body cameras that those two individuals were wearing when they responded to the house, did you not?
Yes,
Okay. And when you reviewed Officer Shara Mehta's body camera, there were probably several different files throughout his time on scene that morning, correct?
yes,
All right. And the first one, the one I want to ask you about, is the one that's activated when he comes to the scene, initially makes entry to Mr. Mattioli's home, okay?
yeah,
Do you recall looking at that one?
yes,
All right. And it's about 20 minutes long, give or take.
okay,
Okay. Any reason to dispute that?
no,
But you watched the whole thing?
yes,
All right. Do you recall towards the end of Officer Shara Mehta's body camera where there was a discussion about the responding, let me back up. So fire department EMTs responded to the scene to help take over care of Mr. Acevedo in the kitchen, right?
yes,
And at some point, they revived or resuscitated Mr. Acevedo and took him to the hospital, right?
correct.
And now, looking back at Officer Shara Mehta's body camera, do you recall towards the end there was a discussion about how best those firefighters could get Mr. Acevedo out of the home?
I don't recall that.
You don't recall. So do you recall watching Officer Shara Mehta suggest going through the front door of the house and trying to do so and finding out that the front door did not work properly?
Yeah, I recall that,
You do recall that?
Yeah.
Okay.
vaguely,
I'm sorry?
vaguely,
Okay. And you also looked at some other body cameras, another officer on scene who had responded named Romero Perez, is that right?
I don't remember Officer Perez.
A female officer who was on scene?
Ramona Perez?
Anna Romero Perez, is that?
Anna Romero Perez, yes.
That's, okay, you remember doing that?
Yeah.
And do you remember reviewing her body cameras as well?
Yes,
And she had talked to a couple different people on scene, including Mr. Peters and Mr. Janowski, right?
I believe so.
And that was done before either of those individuals were formally interviewed, but they were sort of giving statements in the moment as officers were talking to them to see what's going on, right?
Yes,
And do you recall seeing on Officer Romero Perez's body camera, Mr. Janowski describing Mr. Acevedo as, quote, fighting like crazy?
I don't remember those exact words.
Okay. You were at MPD for a long time, true?
Yes,
And now you're at the Milwaukee County DA's office. And as part of what you do as an investigator is you write reports about what you're doing, right?
correct.
To memorialize what you've done, get people's statements, things like that.
Yes,
All right. And did you do so regarding the tasks you did in this investigation?
yes,
Okay. May I approach, Your Honor?
Yes.
And when you write your reports, you do so, again, accurately based on what you've done?
correct.
And if you were to see, strike that, did you write a report about your review of Officer Romero Perez's body cam?
Yes,
If you reviewed that report, would it refresh your recollection about what was on that, what you saw on Officer Romero Perez's body camera?
yes,
Just want you to just look at that and tell me, excuse me, you recognize what that is?
yes, it's my report regarding my interview of Officer Anna Romero Perez and her body cam.
I'm sorry, Ms. Fair. Also, does that report indicate that you looked at her body cameras that she was wearing that day?
Yes,
I'm going to have you turn to page 2, so I don't want you to read it, but just have a look, do it, read it out loud. Just let me know, looking at it, if that refreshes your recollection about what Mr. Janowski has said as captured on Anna Romero Perez's body cam.
yes,
Let me take that back. So having reviewed that document, do you recall whether you observed on Officer Romero Perez's body camera that Mr. Janowski had described Mr. Acevedo as, quote, fighting like crazy?
yes,
Okay. And moving on, another thing that you did in this investigation, you attended an autopsy of Mr. Acevedo, correct?
yes,
And that was done at the Milwaukee County Medical Examiner's Office?
correct.
And you were there just in an observational capacity, correct?
Yes,
And that was done by Dr. Brian Peterson, right?
correct.
Who at the time was the medical examiner for Milwaukee County.
Yes,
He's no longer in that position.
correct.
He's not participating in this case, correct?
I'm not sure if he is or not.
Okay. That was on April 28th of 2020. Does that sound correct?
Yes,
And you are aware that he rendered an opinion that day after the autopsy of a cause of death of anoxic encephalopathy by traumatic asphyxia, correct?
yes,
And you are aware, based on your involvement in the case, that toxicology results for Mr. Acevedo had not been received as of that date, right?
correct.
But Dr. Peterson rendered that opinion anyway, right?
Yes,
And you're aware that Dr. Peterson had not obtained Mr. Acevedo's historical medical records from years past either, correct?
Correct.
That's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Tiffin?
Nothing.
Thank you. Thank you, Investigator Blumey. You can step down. All right, well, it's 6 minutes to noon, so I think this is a good time to stop. Mr. Tiffin?
It probably is the next person will be Officer,
I'm sorry?
it'll be retired Officer Roach, so.
All right, thank you. Right, yeah, I don't think we could complete that before noon, so I do want to give everyone a lunch break. So we're going to break until, let's say, 1:25. Folks, I'm going to ask everyone to be back at 1:25. Please give yourself enough time to return. If you leave the building, you also can go to the cafeteria on the lower level if you want to eat here. Please leave your notebooks here in the courtroom. Again, you shouldn't be taking notes unless evidence is being presented. And you still can't talk about the case. I'm going to sound like a broken record. I will remind you of this every time we go on a break, but it's very important that you not talk about the case with each other or anyone else until you get to deliberations. So we'll break until 1:25. All rise, please.